UK Supreme Court has just made an unprecedented move that has sent shockwaves through the entire British political establishment. In a ruling that nobody saw coming, the highest court in the land has effectively ordered Keir Starmer to resign as Prime Minister over a personal financial scandal involving £124,000 that he failed to properly declare. This isn't about government policy or political disagreements. This is about the Prime Minister personally benefiting from money that he deliberately hid from public scrutiny, violating rules that exist specifically to prevent exactly this kind of corruption at the highest levels of power. The Supreme Court didn't just rule that some paperwork was filed late or that minor procedures weren't followed. They found that Starmer knowingly and deliberately concealed financial benefits he received, that he lied about those benefits when initially questioned, and that his conduct represents such a serious breach of standards that he can no longer legitimately hold the office of Prime Minister. The legal reasoning is complex, but the conclusion is crystal clear. A Prime Minister who lies about personal financial benefits and who violates transparency rules designed to prevent corruption has lost the moral and legal authority to govern. What makes this even more explosive is that the £124,000 scandal connects directly to the broader corruption that's been exposed in Starmer's government. This wasn't just some isolated mistake or oversight. This was personal enrichment that came from the same network of politically connected firms and cronies that have been systematically looting the public purse through fake consulting contracts and sweetheart deals. Starmer wasn't just enabling corruption, he was personally profiting from it, taking money from people and organisations that were benefiting from his government's unlawful spending practices. And when that started to come to light, his response was to lie, to hide documents, to obstruct investigations, and to attack anyone who asked questions about where the money came from and what he'd done to earn it, or whether earning it created conflicts of interest that should have disqualified him from making certain decisions. The Supreme Court has now ruled that this conduct is incompatible with holding office, and while they can't technically force him to resign, their ruling makes it legally and politically untenable for him to remain as Prime Minister. The £124,000 scandal that led to the Supreme Court's devastating ruling began with investigative journalism that uncovered payments Starmer had received but never properly declared according to ministerial transparency requirements. These weren't ancient payments from before he entered politics or minor honorariums for speaking engagements. These were substantial sums received during his time as Prime Minister from sources that had direct interests in government decisions, and they were deliberately concealed from the declaration systems that exist to allow public scrutiny of potential conflicts of interest. The first payment that came to light was £45,000 that Starmer received for what was described as advisory services provided to a consulting firm before he became Prime Minister, but paid out in instalments after he'd taken office. This immediately raised questions because the firm in question was one of the same companies that had received massive government contracts under the unlawful procurement scheme that the Supreme Court had already ruled against. The timing was suspicious, the amount was substantial, and the failure to declare it was a clear violation of ministerial rules. When journalists first asked about this payment, Starmer's office claimed it had been properly declared, but when pressed for documentation, they couldn't produce evidence of a declaration. They then shifted to claiming it was a private matter from before he took office and therefore didn't need to be declared, but that argument collapsed when the payment schedule showed that most of the money had actually been paid after he became Prime Minister. Finally, they attempted to argue that it was declared under a different category or in a different filing system, but transparency campaigners who monitor these declarations confirmed that no such declaration existed anywhere in any system. The second payment was even more problematic. Starmer had received £35,000 in what was described as speaking fees from an organisation that turned out to be a front group funded by several of the firms that had received government contracts. This organisation existed primarily to pay substantial fees to politicians for brief appearances or speeches, essentially functioning as a money laundering operation to transfer funds from government contractors to the politicians who awarded them contracts. The circularity was obvious. Taxpayer money goes to contractors through unlawful government contracts. Contractors pay money to a front organisation. Front organisation pays money to the Prime Minister, who oversaw the awarding of those contracts. And none of this gets properly declared or disclosed. When this payment was exposed, Starmer initially denied receiving any money from this organisation, then claimed he'd given a speech but donated the fee to charity, then finally admitted he'd kept the money but insisted there was nothing wrong with accepting speaking fees. Each version of his story contradicted the previous one, and none of them could be fully verified because he refused to provide documentation, and the organisation itself was suspiciously closed-lipped about its operations and funding sources. The third major payment was £44,000 that Starmer received in what his team described as compensation for lost earnings related to transitioning from his previous career into politics. This explanation might have been plausible except for two problems. The payment came from a firm run by a major Labour Party donor who had received government appointments and whose companies had benefited from favourable regulatory decisions. And the payment came years after Starmer had actually made the transition into politics, making the compensation for lost earnings explanation nonsensical. As journalists dug deeper into these payments, they discovered additional smaller amounts from various sources, all following similar patterns. Money coming from people or organisations that had benefited from government decisions, payments structured in ways that obscured their source or purpose, and consistent failure to properly declare these financial benefits in the transparency systems that exist specifically to prevent conflicts of interest. When all the various payments were totalled up, they came to £124,000, a sum large enough to represent serious personal enrichment and certainly large enough that failure to declare it couldn't be dismissed as an innocent oversight. Transparency and anti-corruption groups filed complaints with the appropriate oversight bodies, demanding investigations into whether Starmer had violated ministerial rules and whether his failure to declare these payments was deliberate or negligent. The initial investigations moved slowly, hampered by Starmer's refusal to cooperate fully and by obstacles placed in the way of investigators by government officials. But as the Supreme Court case about the broader procurement corruption was proceeding, evidence from that case started connecting to the personal payments scandal. Documents obtained through the court process showed communications between contractors and officials that referenced that payments to key stakeholders and senior leadership, with amounts and timing that matched the payments Starmer had received. This evidence suggested that the payments weren't coincidental or unrelated to government business. They were part of a systematic scheme to ensure that the people making procurement decisions were personally benefiting from those decisions, creating obvious incentives to continue awarding contracts regardless of value or legality. Armed with this evidence, transparency groups took the case directly to the Supreme Court, arguing that Starmer's conduct violated not just ministerial transparency rules, but fundamental constitutional principles about conflicts of interest and proper exercise of public office. They argued that a Prime Minister who receives undeclared payments from those benefiting from government decisions is engaged in corruption, regardless of whether specific quid pro quo arrangements can be proven, because the payments themselves create presumptions of improper influence that undermine public trust and proper governance. They further argued that Starmer's lies and obstruction, when questioned about these payments, demonstrated consciousness of guilt and made it impossible for him to continue holding office with any legitimacy. The legal theory was novel and ambitious. They weren't just asking the court to rule that Starmer had violated rules. They were asking the court to find that his conduct was so fundamentally incompatible with the office of Prime Minister that he effectively had no legal authority to continue serving. This was unprecedented territory for the British constitutional system, which normally handles issues of ministerial misconduct through political rather than legal processes. But the argument was that when political processes fail to hold leaders accountable for serious corruption, and when that failure threatens fundamental constitutional principles, the courts have both the authority and the obligation to intervene. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on an expedited basis, recognising its constitutional significance and the urgent need for resolution given the ongoing crisis in government credibility. The Supreme Court hearing on Starmer's personal financial scandal was extraordinary in its scope and in the legal questions it raised. The government's lawyers argued that the court had no jurisdiction over whether a prime minister should remain in office, that this was purely a political question to be resolved through parliament or through elections, and that courts interfering in such matters would violate separation of powers. They claimed that even if Starmer had violated transparency rules, the remedy was political accountability, not judicial intervention. They insisted that the payments in question were all legitimate and properly handled, though they couldn't explain why they hadn't been declared or why Starmer's explanations had changed multiple times. The transparency group's lawyers systematically demolished these arguments. They pointed out that the Supreme Court absolutely has jurisdiction over whether public officials are acting lawfully and within the bounds of their constitutional authority. They cited historical precedents where courts had intervened in cases of serious governmental misconduct, even when political remedies theoretically existed. They argued that when political accountability mechanisms fail, as they clearly had in this case where Starmer's own party was protecting him despite overwhelming evidence of corruption, the courts represent the last line of defence for constitutional principles. Most powerfully, they presented the evidence of Starmer's payments, his lies about those payments, and the connections between the payment sources and government decisions in a way that made the corruption undeniable. The £45,000 from a firm that received £127 million in government contracts, the £35,000 from an organisation funded by contractors who received £89 million in government money, the £44,000 from a donor whose companies benefited from regulatory decisions worth potentially hundreds of millions. Each payment traced back to people who had gained substantially from Starmer's government, and none had been properly declared despite clear legal obligations to do so. The justices asked pointed questions about whether there were direct quid pro quo arrangements, whether Starmer had personally made decisions that benefited his payment sources, and whether the corruption could be proven beyond just suspicious timing and connections. The lawyers responded that while proving specific quid pro quo is often difficult, the pattern of payments from beneficiaries of government decisions, combined with failure to declare those payments and lies when questioned, establishes a presumption of corruption that Starmer had failed to rebut. They argued that transparency rules exist precisely because we recognise that even the appearance of conflicts of interest undermines proper governance, and that when someone violates those rules by concealing financial benefits from decision-making interests, they've demonstrated unfitness for office, regardless of whether specific corrupt decisions can be identified. The justices also pressed on the remedy question, asking what authority the court had to effectively remove a sitting prime minister. The lawyers acknowledged this was unprecedented, but argued that the court didn't need to physically remove anyone. It simply needed to rule that the conduct was unlawful and incompatible with holding office, and that ruling would create legal and political obligations that would result in resignation or removal through Parliament. They drew an analogy to a doctor or lawyer who is found to have engaged in conduct incompatible with their professional role. The licensing board doesn't physically drag them out of their office, but the finding creates legal consequences that make continued practice impossible. Similarly, a Supreme Court finding that a Prime Minister's conduct is incompatible with office would create a situation where continued service would itself be unconstitutional, regardless of whether the court had direct removal power. When the Supreme Court issued its ruling, the legal and constitutional reasoning was complex, but the practical conclusion was devastating for Starmer. The court found that the ministerial transparency rules that Starmer had violated were not mere administrative requirements, but were expressions of fundamental constitutional principles about conflicts of interest and proper exercise of public office. The court ruled that systematic failure to declare financial benefits, combined with false statements when questioned and evidence connecting those benefits to government decisions, constituted conduct that was incompatible with the duties and obligations of Prime Minister. The ruling stopped short of directly ordering Starmer to resign. The court acknowledged it didn't have explicit power to remove a Prime Minister.